Be
This
here.
conference will now be recorded.
Good to be here tonight at Painting the American Revolution with Joel Farkas. Before we begin, I wanted to bring you up to speed on a few virtual events that we'll be hosting later in the month. On the 24th, we'll have virtual Iceland and Greenland, North Atlantic Splendor. 25th, virtual tips for being physically active at home. And on the 26th, Medicare information session. And those are all available to sign up for on the MCL website. All right, now to the main event. Rarely is there a person who has so many and so varied interests as Joel, and also the depth of expertise. I've seen him before. I've looked at his CV. Still teaching at the Learning Institute at Rutgers University and lifelong learning at Fairleigh Dickinson University. Very much looking forward to this event tonight. Thank you, Joel Farkas. Take it away, please.
All right. Good evening, everyone. So, this evening's lecture, Painting. Notice painting is in italics, the American Revolution. We're going to talk about different fine arts and how they talk about and show us the founding of our country. I collect autographs. This is an original document that I own. And in the upper left-hand corner is the signature of King George III. I'm Joel Farkas. I created Revolutionary War Lectures. On your screen is my card. On the bottom of my card is my website. If you go on my website, the first thing you'll see is where I'm lecturing. If any of you want to attend another lecture, just go on my website and find the lecture and get a hold of those people to get a Zoom invite, or if it's nearby, to go in person. Okay, this is our nation's capital, and this is, of course, the dome. Inside of the dome are, among other things, these four paintings. These paintings are 12 feet by 18 feet. I took this picture. You can see the size of the people next to the painting to give you an idea of the size. These were done by the first artist we're going to talk about. His name is John Trumbull. And Congress went to him and said, we'd like you to do some murals on important events that uh, helped create our country. And so John Trumbull presented some ideas, and four were chosen. Those are the four that we're going to start this lecture with. The first one is what we call the Declaration of Independence. Now, in June, notice I said June of 1776, Richard Henry Lee stands up in front of Congress with what becomes known as the Lee Resolution. These United Colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Now let's go back to the painting. What you're seeing is our first Congress, one house, not the way it is today. Our first Congress was under our first Constitution, known as the Articles of Confederation. Again, not the same Constitution that we're under today. The members of Congress are sitting on pretty much the left side of your screen. 5 or 6 or 7 of them are standing. So we have this resolution on the floor. And if this resolution passes, we will just have declared independence, which is kind of a big deal. Now, the members of Congress are not voted in by the people. They're appointed by the various colonial legislatures, but they elect their president. That's the man sitting in the chair behind the desk. That's John Hancock. And John Hancock realizes that, hey, if we declare independence, we have to get the word out to everybody as quickly as possible. Remember, there's no internet, there are no iPhones, there's no television. The way you get the word out is by, in this case, printing. So, to get ready in case this resolution passes, Hancock appoints a 5-man committee to write a draft. Not a finished product, but a draft. And what you see in this painting are the 5-man committee standing in front of Hancock. The tall one in the middle you might recognize as Thomas Jefferson. Now, looking at your screen, to his left is John Adams, to his right is Ben Franklin, in the back are Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston. And What is happening is that they are presenting Hancock with a draft of a declaration. Well, they have the vote, and pretty much miracle of miracles, the resolution passes and we declare independence. So here's a little quiz. I won't be able to hear your answers, but nonetheless, it's kind of fun. On what day, what was the date that we declared independence? So most people say July 4th, but that is wrong. The actual date we declared independence was July 2nd. That's the date the resolution passed. So you say to yourself, so then what's with July 4th? Well, the draft that you saw, the Committee of Five, handing to John Hancock, now every single word in that draft is debated literally. Some are taken out, new words are added. Finally, on the morning of July 4th, it's all done and ratified, and they take these papers down the street to Dunlap printers. Now, takes a long time to set up something to be printed back then. Type is set by hand. It's a hugely labor-intensive practice. So the idea was to print up what are called broadsides. You could almost call them posters. No signatures yet. So the Dunlap printers prints up these broadsides. It took them a couple of days. And then they start being distributed to Washington to be read to the army, to the colonial legislatures, overseas. You can bet every monarchy in Europe is watching this. The copy that we're familiar with, which is called the engrossed copy, is the one on your screen now. Basically, all the draft with all the corrections, etc., is rewritten so that it's basically perfect. The first one to sign, which was in August, is John Hancock. You can see his signature in the center, larger than all the rest. Now, you may have heard that John Hancock said, I'm going to write my signature so large that King George will not need his spectacles to read it. For those of you who have heard that, it's not true. There is no proof anywhere that John Hancock uttered those words. It's just one of those myths, and we're going to talk about more myths as this lecture goes on. And another little quiz. This is a fun one. What word in the Declaration of Independence is not in the Declaration of Independence? This is a tricky one. Not a lot of people get this one. The word is independence. It is not in that document. If any of you play games, it used to be called Trivial Pursuit, but I don't know what kind of games are out these days. But there's some cool stuff here about history that you might be able to stump your friends. Anyway, second painting is this. This is the surrender by the British at the battles of Saratoga. This victory by the Continental Army was the turning point of the war. No one knew it at the time, but this was the turning point of the war. Why? Well, we knew we needed help. And the real choice, the only choice really, was France. And the King of France was Louis XVI. And Louis XVI wouldn't help us openly. They were helping us a little bit on the quiet, but it wasn't nearly enough. And if we didn't get help, quite frankly, we were not going to win the war. Britain would outlast us. So Ben Franklin's living in Paris, trying to persuade Louis XVI to help us, and so on and so forth. And he kept saying that pretty much the same thing. I need to see something, a sign that tells me that you have a chance against the most successful military force in the world. Well, that sign was the victory over the British at Saratoga, where General Burgoyne surrendered his army of almost 6,000 men. And that was the sign. Louis XVI then signs a treaty of alliance and amity and commerce, which tells the world France is now with us fully. By the way, on your screen, on the right side of your screen, is a woman who was the Queen of France, Louis XVI's wife. Who am I talking about? Most of you, who's the only French queen that we ever remember? Her name was Marie Antoinette. Most of you probably got that. What is she famous for having said? Well, when I give this lecture in person, pretty much everyone says, let them eat cake. Trouble is, she never said it. So for those of you who said that, I'm sorry. There is just no proof anywhere that she actually said those words. Now, if you ever come up north to Morristown, in the Morristown Green, you'll see this sculpture, another form of fine arts. This, to me, is independence. It symbolizes independence. So what is happening here? So on your screen on the right, you recognize George Washington, right? In the middle is Alexander Hamilton. And the man talking to Washington, that's the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, all three lived in Morristown in May of 1780. The Marquis has come back from France. He's saying to Washington, my king has signed a treaty. Ships, weapons, men, gold are on the way. And that wins us independence. It's a wonderful, wonderful sculpture. If you ever make your way up to Morristown, just go to the Morristown Green, and you can go right up to it. It's a wonderful sculpture. Third painting, the surrender at Yorktown by the British. This was the last major battle of the war. I'm going to show you this a little bit clearer for a reason. So the morning of the surrender, right? Washington defeats Cornwallis. Morning of the surrender, Cornwallis sends Washington a note. Dear George, I'm not feeling well today, so I don't think I'll be there. I'm going to send General O'Hara in my place. Now, Washington was a real stickler for correct protocol, and he felt he could not accept a surrender from an officer of a lesser rank than he was. So he sends one of his generals, a General Lincoln, no relation to Abraham Lincoln. So that's who you really see in the middle. If you just look at it quickly, you're going to think that's Washington on the horse. Now, there's another horseman a little further back in the painting, kind of middle right. That is George Washington. Observing. I'm going to blow this up. Anybody know who that is standing closest to the horse? That is Alexander Hamilton. If he does this, he will be the greatest man in the world. This is King George, whose autograph I showed you earlier, talking to the artist Benjamin West. And what is he talking about? He's talking about, this is the fourth painting, Washington resigning his commission. Absolutely unheard of at that time for a monarch, any monarch, to voluntarily walk away from power. And that's what this comes down to. Washington did not want anyone to think that he had any designs on power. So the only way to really show that was to just resign his commission and go back to civilian life, which is what he wanted to do. This is an engraving of that particular piece. And when I show this in person, pretty much all the time, or almost all the time, I see a man start to reach for his wallet or a woman go into her purse. Why? Because this is what's on the back of a $5,000 bill. So you can all check your $5,000 bills as soon as this lecture is over. Now, John Trumbull had a relationship with New Haven, Connecticut, and that is where Yale is located. And if you ever go up that way, go to the Yale University Art Gallery, which I might add is free, no charge to get in. There's a section there dedicated to John Trumbull, and these are all original paintings, including much smaller ones of the four that we just saw, the four, the real big ones. Also, Trumbull requested and is buried underneath the art gallery. So I took this picture. So when you're there, he's just buried right under there. Now, I mentioned the artist Benjamin West. So the war is over, and the Crown gives Benjamin West a commission to do a painting of the peace treaty. We'll just call it that. And so the American delegation is there waiting for the British delegation. So you can see the American delegation, of course, in the dark suit is Ben Franklin, sitting, looking at your screen, sitting to his left is John Adams. So the two British designers show up and they see an artist there and they say, wait a minute, why is there an artist here? And they're told, well, we're going to do a painting and it'll go down in history And the two British signers say, not with our faces, you're not. So they sign this document and they run out. Well, poor Benjamin West, he like throws his hands up in the air and he says, who's going to pay me? I can't finish the painting. I'm not going to get paid. Well, John Adams, who I love dearly and was truly one of the most important of all of our founders, he thought this was hysterical. He bought the unfinished painting, had it shipped to his home in Massachusetts. In the 1900s, it was bought by a member of the DuPont family, and you can see it at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. Now, the next artist I'm going to talk about is Charles Willson Peale, and yes, there are two L's in Wilson. He was the first artist to paint George Washington from life. He went down to Mount Vernon. Washington discussed with Peale how he meaning Washington, wanted to appear. He appears here in his French and Indian War uniform. These paintings, particularly of Washington, were extraordinarily powerful. See, Washington became the symbol of the war. Just seeing images of Washington aroused these feelings of pride and patriotism. And of course, that the motivation to continue the fight. There were no internet. There's no internet. There are no billboards. So you hear, but you can't see. So Washington becomes this symbol that the men can see what they're fighting for. Now, the paintings of Washington in particular, in 1779, we have this painting, another one by Charles Willson Peale, hanging in the Pennsylvania State House, which is today Independence Hall. And a loyalist, in other words, loyal to the crown, was so mad that he attacked the painting. He broke into the building and with a knife, he slashed the painting. So Charles Willson Peale was called in. He went back and he did repair it. But these paintings were unbelievably powerful because people are not, unlike today, inundated day in and day out with images. It was a different world. This is a family portrait of Charles Willson Peale. The artist himself is in the painting. He's on the upper left looking down. The focus of this painting, however, is in the middle. There you see Rachel, that's Charles Willson Peale's wife, and their daughter, Margaret. Look at how happy this painting is. You see, the first three children that Charles Willson Peale and Rachel had all died in infancy. This, unfortunately, was not that uncommon in colonial times. So here's Margaret, their fourth child, a happy family portrait. I was not looking for this, but I came across it and I pretty much stopped. This is the most powerful painting that I have come across in almost 9 years of doing lectures. And all of my lectures have a minimum of maybe 125 images, if not more. To me, this is, look at this face. Is this the most peaceful, angelic face really you've ever seen? Well, this is Margaret. The trouble is, Margaret has also died. This painting, you can see the title on it. It's also called Rachel Weeping. And to me, this is the most poignant image I've ever seen. These artists, all the ones that I've spoken about, they were unbelievable artists. And some of these paintings look like photographs. Remember P.T. Barnum, showman extraordinaire? Well, before P.T. Barnum, there was Charles Willson Peale. He started the first natural history museum in the United States. And this is actually a self-portrait. And Peale was 80 years old when he did this. Now, if you ever go down to Philadelphia, in fact, you guys might not be too far, go to the second bank building, not the first, the second, inside of which are over 100 original Charles Willson Peale paintings. It's quite a collection. Charles Willson Peale and his wife, had a bunch of sons who did survive, and they named them after artists. So you've got Rembrandt Peale and Raphael Peale, etc. Now, this is a framing I did. In the center, you see this document, and you can see Charles Wilson Peele's signature on it. But what I did was I took paintings of George Washington that Peele did from life, and I put a date on them. And if you start in the lower left, go up and go across, and then could go down on the lower right. You can almost see Washington aging before your eyes. The one on the lower right was done by Rembrandt Peale, who was a very, very accomplished and well-known artist in his own right. And Rembrandt Peale also did the quintessential Thomas Jefferson, and he also did George Washington from life. Now let's talk about the artist Gilbert Stuart. It's a little story here. Of course, that image that you see on the easel of Washington winds up on the $1 bill. But how did that come about? Well, it came about because of Martha Washington. So in 1796, Martha Washington goes to the painter Gilbert Stuart and says, Mr. Stuart, I just saw a painting that you did of the general last year, and I want you to do another one. I will get the general to sit one last time. Now, the painting she's referring to has been lost. No one knows what happened to that one. So, and she says to Gilbert Stuart, and by the way, when you're finished, you will give it to me. You will make no more copies. You will not give it to anybody else. You will give it to me. He says, no problem. And they agree on a price, and he starts painting. Well, a lot of people come by, and they all want one. This is like the holy grail of painting back then. You've created something that other people want, except he's got a problem. He promised Martha that when he finished, he'd give it to her. What to do? Well, he comes up with a pretty ingenious solution. So, in my imagination, this is what happened. The dialogue is what I'm talking about for the most part. So he turns, Gilbert Stuart turns to George Washington and says, General, I am finished with you. I can do this background on my own. You really don't need to sit here. If you'd like to leave, sir, that would be fine. And of course, Washington was more than happy to get out of there. So he leaves. And again, in my imagination, Gilbert Stuart closes the door, picks up the unfinished painting, puts it in the chair where Washington was sitting. He proceeded to paint over 100 more of these paintings. And he fills in the background. They were all sold. But the original was never finished. He never gave it to Martha. It's called the Athenaeum Washington. It is shared between the Boston Fine Arts Museum and the National Portrait Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And of course, the mirror image is what's on the $1 bill. So we can really thank Martha for that, and of course, Gilbert Stuart. Now, if you're not aware of this, in the War of 1812, British attacked our nation's capital. Some buildings were burned to the ground. Some were partially destroyed. The White House was partially destroyed. Now, the president was James Madison. And as the British were approaching, he says to his wife, Dolly, well, the British are getting closer. We have to leave. And Dolly, who said, no, I'm not going. I'm not leaving till I have to leave. Dolly Madison was a force unto herself. She was really something else. And so Madison and his cabinet leave, and Dolly waits and realizes that the British are getting too close and she has to leave. She looks around, and what does she see but this life-size painting of George Washington on the wall? And she realizes if the British get a hold of that painting, they could turn it into a major, major propaganda piece. So last minute, she has it taken down and rolled up and taken to safety. You can see it today in the National Portrait Gallery. It is done by Gilbert Stuart. So I always like to say Dolly Madison saved George Washington. Now, this is a daguerreotype, another fine arts, if you form a fine arts. It's an early photograph to make life simple. This is Dolly Madison at the age of 80, still a formidable, formidable woman. And besides, how can you not love a woman that has ice cream named after her? Some other images, another image by Gilbert Stuart is this one of Martha Washington. This is kind of the quintessential image of Martha. And this is the earliest known image of Martha. And this is not done by Gilbert Stuart, but just the image in general. And she was 8 years old. And this is the last painting done of Martha in 1801. She died the following year. And lastly, the first artist we spoke about, John Trumbull. Well, this is John Trumbull as painted by Gilbert Stuart. This is a map of North America, circa 1753. So you see the 13 colonies where it says Great Britain. You see all the blue, which is France, French land. And in between, you see this disputed area that both countries claim. And this area was down the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, very, very valuable because that's how goods were transported back then via water. And so the colony of Virginia gets word the British are building fortifications in this area, and they send some of their militia to tell the French to leave. What are militia? Well, in our world, we'd call them citizen soldiers. Thing is, back in colonial times, this was it. There was no army, standing army or otherwise. And the militia back then were barely trained, if at all, haphazardly equipped, if at all. But nonetheless, that is what they had. And this militia is led by a 21-year-old Major George Washington. Well, he gets to the French. French say, nope, we don't agree with you. Washington returns to Virginia. The following year, he goes back. He has more men with him. There's a firefight. Men are killed. This is the beginning of what we call the French and Indian War. Now, Washington and his men are driven back. Virginia requests and receives a standing army from England. You can see by the picture, beautifully equipped, most successful fighting force, certainly in the Western Hemisphere. And they have to fight alongside the militia, or just about the opposite in all regards. Well, the British had nothing but contempt for the militia, disdain, and they ridiculed the militia mercilessly. And how did they do that? They did that with a song called Yankee Doodle. So on the count of three, you are all going to start singing Yankee Doodle. 1, 2, 3, begin. Yankee Doodle. Okay, you can stop. I know I can't see you or hear you, but when I do this in person, I always find it amazing. People, they remember the melody, and in many cases, remember a lot of the words. Isn't that amazing? When was the last time you sang the song or even thought about it? And speaking of words, what do the words mean? Well, let's take a look. First of all, what's a Yankee? Do not say a baseball player. A Yankee is a derogatory term used by the British against the colonists. What's a doodle? A simpleton. So Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. Now, stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni? What does pasta have to do with anything? Well, in colonial times, if you were the epitome, the height of Italian fashion, you were called a macaroni. So now what the song is saying, look at these colonists. They are so dumb. They think that by putting a feather in their hat, it makes them the height of fashion. And that is what those words mean. Of course, it eventually morphs, the whole idea of Yankee Doodle morphs into a patriotic song, play, etc. Now let's look at the fine arts as influencers, for those who know what I'm talking about. Before TikTok and before Instagram, there was the pamphlet, the painting, and the poem. A pamphlet was called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, one of the most influential pamphlets literally ever written. The largest selling American title based on this population and the number of copies sold. Hugely influential in persuading people to be for separation. The historian Gordon Woods calls it the most incendiary and popular pamphlet of the entire Revolutionary era. This is the painting. This is Washington crossing the Delaware. Now, the painting, Washington is crossing from Pennsylvania back into New Jersey. But we're going to go a little bit before this happens. We're going to flip this painting around. So Washington is being chased by the British all through New Jersey. This is 1776. In December, he gets to the Delaware. He crosses over into Pennsylvania, and he's met by the Kingston Trio. Yes, the Kingston Trio. Any of you remember the Kingston Trio? In 1961, they had this hit song called the MTA. The opening line of this song, "These are the times that try men's souls." You know who wrote those words? Thomas Paine. But not in Common Sense. He wrote another pamphlet called The American Crisis. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us: at the heart of the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Paine wrote this while he was with Washington's army. He gave it to Washington. He was so taken with it, he had it read to his men. Another hugely influential pamphlet. Now, earlier I showed you the green in Morristown. Just 5 minutes away is this little park called Burnham Park. In it is a statue of Thomas Paine, and he is writing, "These are the times that try men's souls," on that scroll. But let's go to the painting. So now Washington crosses over the Delaware back into New Jersey, and this leads to the battles of Trenton and Princeton. But this painting is not accurate. It's not even close, but it was not meant to be. You see, the painter Emanuel Leutze, who studied art in America, he was German, he's back in Europe. Some political revolutions were spreading across Europe, somewhat similar to the American Revolution. And so Leutze hopes that if people work together, they can affect a change. So he has the painting. A lot of things are not correct on it, but that's not the point. So hugely influential. And lastly, what am I going to talk about? Look at that on your screen. Pretty much every time I do this, everyone knows we're talking Paul Revere's Ride. The poem was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Why did he write the poem? Well, just like the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, the poem was not meant to be an accurate representation of an event. He uses the event as a warning. So the original ride, 1775, was a warning that the British have learned that Samuel Adams and John Hancock are hiding in Lexington and they're wanted by the British for treason. And that in Concord, the militia, the Minutemen, have hidden ammunition and weapons, etc. So the British are going to send out a patrol to go to both places. Now, the poem is a warning. You see, Longfellow sees the country rapidly heading towards a revolution of its own, a civil war over the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery. See, this poem was written in 1860. So it's not meant to be an accurate representation of an event. There's another reason for it. I'm going to read you a few lines of this poem. It's an absolute work of genius. "Listen, my children, you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April of 75, hardly a man is now alive." Well, think about this. The original ride was 1775. The poem was written in 1860. That's 85 years after the event. You bet there's hardly a man still alive. I'm going to skip to the end. Born on the night wind of the past, right? Born 85 years earlier in the hour of darkness and peril and need. This is what Longfellow was seeing. The country is rapidly heading towards a civil war. The people will waken and listen to hear. This was Longfellow's hope. The midnight message. Midnight, there is no time left, of Paul Revere. It's an absolute work of genius. On the other hand, let's now talk about the real ride. And it all starts with this man, doctor, as a medical doctor, Joseph Warren, who's the acting head of the Sons of Liberty in Boston, because Hancock and Adams are in, that's Samuel Adams, John Hancock's second cousin, are in hiding in Lexington, as I said. So Warren has a spy in British headquarters who alerts him what the British are up to. So he calls in his favorite writer, Paul Revere, to go and alert Lexington and Concord. And then he realizes, well, wait a minute. There are random British patrols out at night. What if one of them stops Paul Revere? Who's going to warn Lexington and Concord? So he calls in a second man, a man named William Dawes. And both Dawes and Revere ride out. They just take different routes, but they both did the exact same thing. Thing is, no one's ever heard of William Dawes because he was not in the poem. Well, I always felt sorry for William Dawes. So we're going to do a little shout out, a little remembrance to William Dawes. I'm not going to read you this whole thing, just a little bit of it. 'Tis all very well for the children to hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. But why should my name be quite forgot? Who rode as boldly and well, got what? Why should I ask? The reason is clear. My name was Dawes, and his Revere. a little a little tribute to the forgotten man of Paul Revere's ride, William Dawes. This is another one of the premier artists of that period, John Singleton Copley, who painted the quintessential images of the main players of Paul Revere's ride. So this is Dr. Joseph Warren. Again, these are all by John Singleton Copley, Paul Revere, John Hancock, and Samuel Adams. Another form of fine arts are engravings. This is an engraver named Henry Pelham. And engravers would come up with ideas and do the engraving, print off copies, and sell them. This is how they made extra money between commissions. So after the Boston Massacre, the Bloody Massacre on King Street, Pelham comes up with this engraving, but he doesn't do much with it. Now, a second engraver sees it, comes across, and says, hey, wait a minute. I can make some subtle changes and turn this into a major propaganda piece against the British. So I took the two and I combined them. So on your left, I'm going to blow this up. So you see the building on your left. You see 2 floors of windows. There's a little balcony. And between the 2 floors is basically wall, correct? Now look what the second engraver did. Where before it was walls, now he put a sign, Butcher's Hall. Get it? The British are butchering your friends and neighbors. That's just one of the subtle differences that turned it into a major propaganda piece and a big seller. So here's a little quiz. Who was the second engraver? His name was Paul Revere, who did a lot more than just ride a horse. Benedict Arnold. Before Benedict Arnold was a traitor, he was the best officer Washington had. Literally. He was the only officer winning anything. He wanted to fight, and he was not afraid. And he had terrific instincts. And in many ways, he's somewhat similar to George S. Patton in World War II, a military genius, but had other issues in terms of getting along with people and so on and so forth. Well, first he's a hero, and then of course he becomes a traitor. 100 plus years later, we have markers commemorating something in our history. Of course, where we live, there are markers everywhere, which is great. You know, this house was here, and this battle was here, and this person did this, and so on and so forth. And so the question became, at the times where Arnold was the hero of a situation, do you mention his name in the marker? Now, Arnold's first success was capturing Fort Ticonderoga. So coincidentally, he and another man's name was Ethan Allen. You may have heard of him in the Green Mountain Boys, or if not, he also has a chain of furniture stores. Just kidding. So they each had the same idea. They went to um, uh, two different committees of safety. And of course, neither knew what the other was doing, which is okay. But they find out that they're both on their way to capture Fort Ticonderoga, so they kind of join forces, and they're successful. So here's a marker, and if you don't bother reading it, but trust me when I tell you, Arnold's name is not on it. Ethan Allen's name is, but Arnold's name is not. Next, Arnold is tasked by Washington to lead a force of men up through what is today the state of Maine in December, with no roads. Think about this for a second. To try to capture Quebec City. He's not able to do it, but it was certainly not for lack of trying. He was wounded in that battle. He actually comes away from it, even though he was not successful. He was one of two commanders, and so here's a marker commemorating that, where they name Benedict Arnold in the marker. Next, Washington turns to Arnold and says the British are sending down a fleet of ships from Canada down the Richelieu River, down Lake Champlain, over to Lake George. They're going to hook up with the Hudson and kind of meet up with British troops coming west out of New York City and try to cut off all the New England colonies. Turns to Arnold and says, stop them. Now, Arnold had experience with boats. So he builds this small fleet of gunboats, excuse me, comes up with a strategy around a place called Valcour Island. And although he loses the battle, he delays the British long enough that they have to return to Canada because it's late in the year and Lake Champlain is going to start to freeze pretty soon. So the British are not successful in trying to hook up with British soldiers coming west out of New York City. So here's a marker where they mention Benedict Arnold by name, and here's a marker where they do not. Now, the last success of Benedict Arnold, when you saw this picture early on in this lecture, was Saratoga. This was as I said earlier, the turning point of the war, and the hero was Benedict Arnold. The man who took all the credit was General Gates. That's another story. Now, in this battle, Arnold is wounded in the leg. Remember I told you he was wounded in the leg, the battle for Quebec City? Well, he's wounded in the same leg again. Now, 100 plus years later, the question becomes, with a marker, do we mention Benedict Arnold's by name? And the answer is no. We mentioned his leg. This is called the Boot Monument. If you go to Saratoga National Historical Park, this is what you will see. So this is how they commemorate the victory and in an indirect way, Benedict Arnold, but they don't actually mention Benedict Arnold by name. So George Washington, there's a lot of stories, myths about George Washington. For example, false teeth. Yes, he really did have false teeth. But the question is, what were they made out of? Well, most people say wood, and the answer is never. You heard me, they were never, ever wood. How did that even get started? Well, I don't know how it got started. So one day I decided to call up Mount Vernon. I figured if anyone knows, they're going to know. And just by luck, I was able to get a hold of the head researcher, a really sweet woman who she's since retired. Mary Thompson was her name. At any rate, and I told her why I was calling. I said, just tell me how this got started. And she laughed and she says, we have no idea. Sometimes you just don't know how something like this gets started. Well, so what's the story with his false teeth? Well, if you had to pick one word, you'd probably pick the word ivory. But that's only partial. If they had to make teeth, they would oftentimes carve them from ivory. But his teeth were actually, his false teeth were actually made of a number of different things. There were animal teeth. There were human teeth. There were teeth that were made. These teeth were set in a metal base. There's probably lead in that metal, but what are you going to do? So this was brand new technology, by the way. This is like cutting edge stuff. And so Washington finds a dentist who says, "Okay, I can do this." And dentist fashions these false teeth, comes to Washington, puts them in Washington's mouth, and Washington opens his mouth, but the teeth just kind of sat there. So the dentist was a cool guy. He said, "I'll be back." He comes back. He puts the teeth in Washington's mouth. Washington opens his mouth and the teeth open. What did the dentist do? Springs. He put springs in the upper and lower jaw. So, at any rate, would never happen. How did George Washington die? Well, a lot of people say he caught pneumonia or something similar like that, and he did get sick. But the sickness led to what is called acute bacterial epiglottitis. Now, your epiglottis is this little flap in your throat, and when you swallow, it covers your windpipe. So food will not go into your lungs, it'll go into your stomach. Well, Washington was out at Mount Vernon 2 days in a row in basically a blizzard, snowstorm, ice storm, gets sick. His epiglottis became infected. Now, the cure-all for everything back then was bleeding. And Washington, based on the doctor's notes, had between 35 and 40% of his blood bled out, which probably put him into shock. It might not have killed him. Didn't help him. But what killed him was the fact that his epiglottis became infected. The infection caused it to expand, to swell, and basically he choked or suffocated to death. And that is how Washington died. Now on your screen, I want to talk about the cherry tree. We know how this started and where this came from. It came from this man, a man named Mason Locke Weems, also known as Parson Weems. And after Washington had died, he wrote this little book, and each chapter showed one of George Washington's attributes, and the book was geared towards younger readers. Now, this is the artist Grant Wood. Ironically, this is one of his paintings, which is The Ride of Paul Revere. But that's not the one that most people know him for. They know him for this one. This is called American Gothic. And I want to take a little side trip. We're going to go down to Grounds for Sculpture. I don't know if any of you have been there, but if you do, if you go there, first you will see this gigantic American Gothic, which I think is absolutely the coolest thing going, except for one other one, which really has nothing to do with this lecture, but it's pretty funny. So there I am holding on to Marilyn Monroe's calf. But let's go back to Grant Wood. So Grant Wood did a painting called Parson Weems' Fable. And you see Parson Weems, and look at his hand and his finger pointing at George Washington holding the axe, saying to his father, "I cannot tell a lie, I chopped down the cherry tree." But let's look at George Washington a little bit closer, because there you see Gilbert Stuart's 66-year-old head on a 6-year-old body. So what is Grant Wood trying to say? Well, in my opinion, he's trying to say George Washington is ageless, George Washington is timeless, and George Washington orders you to attend my next lecture. Now, we started this lecture with this autograph, King George III. I'm going to show you one more autograph. Elvis Presley. This is a record album I own, autographed by the King. And why am I showing you Elvis Presley? Because on behalf of myself and the real King, see the guy on your left on your screen, that's King George. By the way, look at the expression on King George's face as he's looking at Elvis. You think maybe he wishes he was Elvis? At any rate, on behalf of myself and the real King, thank you. Thank you very much. So there's my card, revolutionarywarlectures.com. You can see where I'm lecturing if you want to attend another lecture. I'm going to get out of screen sharing and we'll see if we have any questions.
Yeah, if
All
anybody
right,
has any
thank you, Joe.
questions,
Okay,
go ahead
there we
and
go.
join in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
Yeah, we're
Chip.
getting
I'll leave it
some
up to you.
comments. This comment in the chat. This was a great lecture. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So we still do have some time for more questions before we end for the evening. A lot of wonderful information there.
Thank you. I actually have a lot of fun writing these lectures, especially when I find out things. I always thought this, and then it turns out it's that, and I don't know, just kind of fun.
Absolutely. Let's see. Thank you. This was an entertaining way to present our history.
Thank
So
you.
very good
Good. And
positive
and you know what?
responses.
That's terrific because that's what I try to be. I try to be informative, but also entertaining. Otherwise, it's going to be high school, and most history, at least when I was in high school, was pretty dull.
Mhm.
So, thank you.
Thank you, Joel. And thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you, Laura. And that'll do it
We did
for
have a
us for
question come
this
in.
evening. Oh, all right. Besides John Trumbull buried under the Yale Museum, does any other museum have someone buried beneath it? And then another thank you. I really enjoyed this lecture.
I don't know the answer to that. You probably Google it or go on
Okay.
ChatGPT or whatever, but I don't know.
Interesting question. All right. Well, thank you all very much. That'll do it for us. And we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you all. Good night.